Good evening, folks. If you have not already watched it, this is part 2 of my lecture on plant taxonomy and systematics as we're going through the various kinds of plants and what distinguishes them. If you've not already watched part 1, I recommend you go back and do that. It provides some important background on what is a plant at a biological level, the features that distinguish them from other forms of life, a basic overview of plant classification, and information on the simplest varieties of plants, the bryophytes. Picking up where we left off, we're now talking about the tracheophytes, which comprise about 93% of all living plants, and which are the vascular plants. Now, end of last time, we sort of lined up what features we can expect a tracheophyte to have. Tracheophytes, first and foremost, have a vascular system. They're plants that have specialized vascular tissues, an internal sort of ductwork for moving fluids and nutrients around from one part of the plant to another. That's a significant advantage in that it allows the plants to grow significantly further from the ground. Remember, your bryophytes have to stay in ground-hugging carpets. They have to stay low because every part of the plant has to be near to the ground to get its own water and nutrients, whereas our tracheophytes can conduct water and nutrients from ground level higher up into the structure of the plant, therefore they can get much taller and larger. Your tracheophytes are going to have some of the features we associate just with kind of plants in general in our heads. They are going to have stems, they are going to have roots, they are going to have leaves. All of these are distinctive tracheophyte features. One or two other quick things about them that tracheophytes are going to have some adaptations for staying on dry land. We believe they were the first plants to move onto dry land. Bryophytes seem to have originated in watery environments and eventually made the jump to land. But tracheophytes have two special adaptations that are generally lacking in bryophytes for coping with the terrestrial environment. One of those is going to be a cuticle. We mentioned before that cuticles are a thing some plants have and others do not. The cuticle of tracheophytes has two prominent features. One, it has wax, which allows the plant to avoid desiccation in an atmosphere and helps it to retain water. And two, the cuticle contains a protein called cutin. Cutin is an anti-pathogenic protein, helps the plant to defend itself from outside infection by viruses, by bacteria, or by other pathogens that might cause it problems. Plants don't have an immune system like you do, so external defenses are really important in that regard. Now, other feature that they have that's an important adaptation for life on land is a thing called stomata. Stomata are tiny pores or holes in the leaves and stem of the plants. The purpose of the stomata is to emit carbon dioxide. Now, the important thing here for moisture protection is that the plant does need to take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen as part of its respiration process. But we don't always want that to be happening, particularly whenever it's a hot, dry situation and the plant stands to lose a lot of water by having open pores to the outside environment. So stomata can be opened or closed as needed. These little tiny openings can be shut off whenever the environment is dry and opened up when it's humid, so that the plant engages in gas exchange at times that are most effective for it to not lose too much water at the same time. There are a couple of bryophytes that have stomata, but they seem to have evolved independently, and tracheophytes, they are basically a universal feature. So, what do our tracheophytes look like? We've got two big categories of tracheophytes. We have the seedless vascular plants and the seed plants. Our seedless vasculars are the variety that are more familiar. Less familiar. They're a polyphyletic group. They don't seem to have one common seedless vascular ancestor. Seedless vascular plants are going to typically be fairly small. They usually don't get above about 50 centimeters tall in the modern world. There are some extinct ones that were much, much larger, but those are long gone. They have complex branching bodies. They have lots of sporangia. The sporophyte is the dominant generation. You might recall with the bryophytes that the gametophyte was the dominant generation. With our seedless vasculars, the sporophyte is the dominant generation. In fact, the gametophytes of seedless vascular plants hardly ever break the surface. Usually the gametophyte spends its entire existence as a small subterranean plant. The gametophytes release their sperm into the soil around the plants, and the sperm travel through water films in the soil to enter and fertilize other nearby gametophytes. For this reason, you're going to find that seedless vascular plants rely on moist soil. They do not do well in dry or arid environments. You'll often find them growing as low canopy plants underneath trees and forests, low-lying plants that are close to the moist soil down at the bottom. Now, our seedless vascular plants are going to come in a couple of different varieties. We've got a few different forms of seedless vasculars. Some are you going to be familiar with, some not so much. 2 living phyla of seedless vascular plants. First off, we have the phylum Lycophyta, Lycophyta, or the lycophytes as they're called. These are the oldest living vascular plants. They represent a pretty good picture of what early vascular plants looked like, and we have a lot of fossil lycophytes that we have found over the years. Vascular plants in this category are going to include a couple things you probably are not as well familiar with. We have club mosses. Despite the name, club moss is not actually a moss. It gets its name because it's kind of little club-shaped spiral masses attached to it. We've got plants called spike mosses, about 700 different species of those. And we have plants called quillworts. There are about 192 known species of quillworts. The remainder of the 1,200 or so living species of lycophytes, so about 300 or so, are going to be club mosses. These are not terribly familiar plants. I know you are probably have not heard of any of them. They are going to be low herbaceous plants. All of them like moist environments. Recommend you look up some pictures on Google. Like I said for the last lesson, have a Google Images search window open so you can get some images of some of these to hear what I'm talking about. Your lycophytes that we see today are very different than the lycophytes that we had not all that long ago. The Carboniferous period, which was, if you got your handy-dandy geologic time scale that I passed out early on in the class, you will see that the Carboniferous period began about 359 million years ago, went till about 299 million years ago. This was the time when the lycophyte plants really thrived. They did extremely well in this environment, and in fact, they formed large woody varieties. All living lycophytes today are herbaceous, but during the Carboniferous, we formed massive woody lycophytes. The very first trees on Earth were lycophyte trees. And in fact, the earliest known tree fossils were found right here in western Pennsylvania and in eastern Ohio. You go up to Moraine State Park, just a little bit north of Pittsburgh. They have some trails up there where you can actually see fossil lycophytes along the trail. Some of the earliest known trees anywhere on Earth are from right there. Now, your lycophyte forests covered the landscapes during the Carboniferous. They were the dominant plant life. They grew to tremendous heights. We have found examples of lycophyte trees that got as tall as 100 meters. They were massive, massive plants. Now, here's the thing about this. We have these plants that are newcomers on the landscape, right? Lycophytes are brand new at this time. They're just starting to really dominate the terrestrial environment. They're not competing with anything. There's nothing else like them. And so they're growing and they're getting bigger and they're spreading out into the environment. The environment is rich in carbon dioxide. They have lots to sustain their growth. There's no other canopy that they're competing with for sunlight, so they grow and grow and grow. And these early lycophytes get tremendous. Nothing like them has ever lived. But if you're growing that much, you are soaking up lots and lots of carbon dioxide. The lycophyte forests end up becoming a significant carbon sink. They're reducing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere by a factor of 5. With that much carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere, we get the opposite of what we have today. We're going to get climate change, but it's going to be global cooling. not global warming. And what we're going to find is that at the end of the Carboniferous, the planet is going to actually go into an ice age. We're going to go into a significant ice age as a result of all this plant growth, reducing the carbon content of the atmosphere, so we're not retaining heat as a planet as well. And that ice age, actually, with widespread glaciation, kills the early lycophyte forests. And all these huge lycophyte plants eventually collapse into the swamps where they were growing. We've already established boggy water is not a good decay environment. And that means that this partially decayed plant matter is going to sink into the bogs and build up and build up and build up. And eventually it gets buried under many, many layers of sediment and soil and compressed down. And the lycophyte forests, folks, are the origins of most of our fossil fuels. Pennsylvania is so very rich in fossil fuels precisely because during the Carboniferous we were so rich in lycophyte trees. And now those have become the coal, oil, and natural gas that are the basis of our modern energy economy. We're releasing the energy stored by those ancient plants millions and millions of years ago. But we're also releasing the carbon, which means that right now, as we burn through our fossil fuel stores, we are putting all that carbon that the lycophytes removed from the atmosphere back into it. And we're making the planet warmer, and swampier, and more tropical. In other words, we're getting the global warming effect of climate change. Basically, we're restoring the conditions that existed much more globally during the time when the lycophytes dominated the planet. And that's not going to work out well for a planet that is not adapted to those kind of conditions anymore. So lycophytes had a very interesting role in the early history of plant life on Earth. They're not much left anymore. 1,200 or so species, they are bit players in the modern ecosystem. Now, our other major variety of seedless vascular plant is one that you're probably a bit more familiar with because we have a fair number of them around here. And that would be the pterophytes, P-T-E-R-O-P-H-Y-T-E. Pterophytes, members of the phylum Pterophyta. Now, the pterophytes are going to include a couple of plants you may not know as well. The horsetails, you might have seen those growing around the edge of bodies of water. Your whisk ferns, the name fern here should not be considered really a good descriptor because they're not truly ferns. They kind of look like a little whisk broom when you see them. And whisk ferns are interesting because they're the only vascular plants that lack roots and leaves. They have lost those features in the course of their evolution. So much like your bryophytes, they lie very low and close to the ground to get water and nutrients. So they're called a whisk fern, but they're not a fern, and they act like a moss, even though they're a vascular plant. Go figure. But the biggest group of the pterophytes, comprising about 12,000 living species, would be the ferns. Ferns are some of the oldest plants still alive on Earth. They have been around since the Devonian period, that is going back about 416 million years. Ferns are really effective in low-lying areas. They tend to grow beneath the canopies of forests, low and close to the ground. They form big leafy growths, as you well know. The coolest thing about ferns is they have a fractal growth pattern. If you look at a fern, you've got that stem with then the little triangular leaves coming off of it. But if you look at those triangular leaves, each triangular leaf is the whole pattern of the fern all over again. In other words, it's got a central vein with little leaves coming off of it. And each of those has a central vein with little leaves coming off of it. Some branches go down about 7 generations of some ferns, I should say, go down about 7 generations of branching that way. And the cool thing about that is that it actually gives them a way higher total surface area than they would if they were just a flat sheet of green. As a result, they can maximize the sunlight they are collecting from the low-lying canopied environment. Ferns have been remarkably successful. They lasted through the entirety of the Permian extinction. They lasted through the KT events. They actually were the dominant plants on Earth very briefly after the KT events, and they are still with us today. The state of Pennsylvania has more than 20 species of fern that are found here alone. Now, just a couple of general things about lycophytes. Like I said, they like moist soil. Their gametophytes are very delicate, dry out easily, so they stay almost entirely subterranean. The Antheridia, the male gametangia, release sperm into moisture in the soil, they swim to the nearby archegonia of the female, and then that gives rise to the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte is what you see above the ground. Sporophytes of your various seedless vascular plants tend to get big and leafy. Like I said before, lots of leafy growth to sustain photosynthesis in low-lying environments. They also have a specialized type of leaf called a sporophyll. This is a common feature we see throughout lycophytes, but mostly in ferns. Sporophyll. Sporophylls are specialized leaves that have sporangia attached to them. So it's part leaf, part sporangia. The sporangia can take two different forms in our seedless vascular plants. Some of them take the form of what we call sori, S-O-R-I, which are little clusters of sporangia found on the underside of the leaf. That's what we see happening in ferns. Others form what we call strobili, S-T-R-O-B-I-L-I. Strobili are cone-shaped sporangia, often found at the tips of leaves. They're not true cones. Don't mistake them for the cone-bearing plants we're going to talk about in a little bit here. Another important thing to know about our seedless vasculars is that they are typically homosporous, H-O-M-O-S-P-O-R-O-U-S, homosporous. Prefix homo means same spores. What this means is that the spores are not distinctly male or female, that the spores are bisexual, if you will. They, not in the sense we usually mean bisexual, in the sense of having two sexes, that the spores are both male and female and produce both kinds of gametangia in the resultant gametophytes. Whereas in most other plants, you're going to find that the gametophytes are distinctly male or female in one or the other. All right, so we've got some seedless vascular plants left, but they have a lot of disadvantages. Their spores are carried by winds in the canopy of the low-lying environments. Their gametophytes stay underground, but they can only thrive in, again, certain moist soils. Dry environments don't really support them well because of their lack of seeds. It is very, very easy for them to die without fertilization. So we need a way to improve on that. And that brings us to the most abundant plants living today, the spermatophytes, S-P-E-R-M-O-T-O-P-H-Y-T-E, spermatophytes. Spermatophytes are what you know better as seed plants, and they are the far and away most common plants alive on Earth today. Spermatophytes have dominated the plant landscape for a while. The first spermatophytes were already starting to form around the base of those big lycophyte forests. Tiny little seed plants starting to form up right about that time. But they were not going to be able to really compete while giant lycophytes were soaking up all the sunlight. Just had little tiny lowliers. Well, after that big global ice age, big lycophyte trees die off. Seed plants are better suited to weather the storm. Seed plants do way better in changing climate conditions, for reasons we'll get into shortly. And as a result, they kind of move into the ecological space left behind by the lycophytes. They are going to therefore become the dominant plants in fairly short order. They're going to really break onto the landscape about 320 million years ago is when we're really going to see seed plants starting to take off. Following the end of the Carboniferous, they are going to fully become the dominant plant life on Earth. And they remain so today. About 90% of all living plants are going to be our seed plants. Now, seed plants have a couple of features that distinguish them. One, seed plants tend to exhibit heterospory, H-E-T-E-R-O-S-P-O-R-Y, or they are heterosporous. Prefix hetero means other. What this means is that seed plants have distinctly male and female spores. As a result, they produce distinctly male and female gametophytes. rather than having the bisexual ones that we talked about before. Secondly, we're going to find that seed plants are going to be characterized by greatly reduced gametophytes, that the gametophyte generation is going to be much, much tinier in our seed plants. In fact, in our seed plants, the gametophyte is typically microscopic. The gametophyte matures within the tissue of the parents. Never actually leaves. The sporophyte is what you see. Sporophyte is the dominant generation of our seed plants, and you're almost never going to see the gametophyte unless you take it apart and look inside the parent with a microscope. And of course, the big distinguishing feature of seed plants, the thing that is the key to their success, is seeds. We think plants, we think seeds automatically, right? There's no such thing as a fern seed. Certain ferns don't have that. There are no moss seeds. You can get spores, but not seeds. Seed plants have the seed as its primary reproductive units. A seed is a plant embryo, already fertilized, packed into a special protective coating, and packed in with a store of nutrients. The seed basically has a reservoir of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates built into it. Having a seed as the reproductive structure is an incredibly beneficial quality for seed plants, because for starters, the seed can go dormant for a long period of time. This is a big part of why seed plants did really well in the post-Lycophyte Ice Age. Seeds can lie dormant in the soil, ungerminated, until conditions suit their germination. The seed coat protects them and makes sure that they are able to weather out whatever the bad conditions are. How long can seeds last? Well, fun story. Back in the 1960s, there were some archaeological excavations happening in Israel, and the archaeologists found a sealed clay jar buried underground that contained seeds from a plant called the Judean palm. Now, the Judean palm was a major cash crop in ancient Palestine and Judea, the kingdoms located where Palestine and Israel are today. And the Judean palm was a source of palm fruit, a source of wood, a source of palm oil. It was a significant economic driver. Now, 2,000 years ago, when the Romans conquered Judea and Palestine, they found that the local population was not bowing down easily. And what did they do? To decimate the economy in the area, they burned the Judean palm groves, razed them to the ground. The Judean palm was driven to extinction by the Roman invaders. It's one of the first known examples we have of human beings actually eradicating a species. Well, now we had some Judean palm seeds, and they got shoved in a drawer for decades. And about 10 years ago, an Israeli archaeologist found them stored in a museum archive and said, I wonder. So she planted a couple of them. And right now, we have growing in Israel some live Judean palms. For the first time in 2,000 years, the species is alive again, back from extinction. Now, last I knew, all the seeds that they had successfully germinated were bearing male plants. And as a result, there is not, at this point in time at least, a way of perpetuating the species. But it is hoped that maybe one of the seeds will give rise to a female, and as a result, we might be able to get live Judean palms thriving and reproducing again. That's not even the record holder, folks. Some Siberian scientists a few years back, and I think I put an article about this in your articles folder on Blackboard, so check that out, discovered seeds in the Arctic tundra from a variety of flower that went extinct during the last ice age. The seeds had been preserved by the glacial environment. The seeds were planted in a pot in a Russian laboratory, and we now have some Ice Age era flowers growing there, flowers that have not been seen by human eyes for almost 30,000 years. We don't know what the expiration date of a seed is, folks. Obviously, you need careful conditions to preserve them. Seeds can rot, seeds can get damaged, but if you've got a very dry and sealed off environment, like the example of the Judean palms, or if you have a very frozen environment, like those flowers in the Arctic tundra, apparently seeds can last for tens of thousands of years. In addition to their high durability, seeds have another feature that helps them out. The embryo is packaged with a bundle of nutrients. Those nutrients help to sustain it until it has developed and grown large enough to begin photosynthesizing for itself. As a result, you're going to find that your seed plants have a much higher success rate of germination, I've been using that word germination, Germination. Germination is the genesis of a plant, the growth of a plant. And your seed plants are going to be very, very effective at this because their seeds have those nutrients built in. It feeds them until such time as they can begin to make their own food. That quality of the seed, its durability, its ability to go dormant for a long time, and the fact that it feeds the developing plant early in its life, all those reasons together have made seed plants immensely successful. And therefore, it should come as no surprise that they are the dominant plant life on Earth. Now, 5 of our 10 living phyla of plants are seed plants, and we can divide them into 2 broad categories, one much more abundant than others. Firstly, we have the gymnosperms, Gymnosperms, gymnosperms. That literally translates as naked seed. The prefix gymno means nude or naked. The reason for that is because gymnosperms do not have a protective seed chamber. More on that in a moment. Gymnosperms do not produce flowers, nor do they produce fruits. Their seeds are found in cones. So these are cone-bearing plants. Typically, you will find that there are distinctly male and female cones. The male cone grows higher up, typically on the plant, than the female cone. The reason is because when the seeds mature within the male cone, the fronds of the cone, the little filaments, the little leaflets of the cone, open up. You've all seen a cone that's closed tight and pointy, and a cone that's opened up wide. That wide open cone is a male cone. That way, the seeds were able to be released and precipitate down to potentially fertilize the female cones below. I'm saying seeds. Pollen is what I should be saying. No, skip the reference to seeds that whole time. Pollen. But the seeds do, in fact, mature in cones. When the female cone is fertilized, she will open her fronds in order to release seeds, which will then be carried on the wind. Now, gymnosperms fall into 4 living phyla. They are not terribly abundant plants. There are not a lot of gymnosperm species left. About 1,000 living species of gymnosperms are still to be found on Earth. Now, they fall in 4 phyla. We have the phylum Cycadophyta, Cycadophyta. Yeah, Cycadophyta, or the cycads. There are about 300 living species of cycad. A lot of people mistake them for ferns when they see them growing in a pot in somebody's office or whatever. We often see them as office plants or ornamental plants. You'll have a spray of long, sharp, pointy leaves, usually kind of a blade-like leaf extending out from a central mass for the plant. The cones typically appear in the middle of the plant and rise up centrally. Again, look up a picture of a cycad. It's a good way of representing them. They're quite hardy plants. They do well in a wide variety of environments. They originated in tropical environments, but they've been exported all over the world. And you've probably seen them growing in somebody's house or again in an office, or they're ornamental plants you see in a lot of gardens and things too. Then we have a really interesting phylum, the phylum Ginkgophyta. Watch the spelling here. G-I-N-K-G-O, ginkgo. The phylum Ginkgophyta is interesting because it is an entire phylum of life represented by exactly 1 living species. There is exactly one species in the entire phylum Ginkgophyta, and that is the species Ginkgo biloba, the ginkgo tree. That's G-I-N-K-G-O, ginkgo. That's the genus. Biloba, B-I-L-O-B-A. That's the species, Ginkgo biloba, or ginkgo for short. You can call them that because they're the only one. Ginkgo biloba is the only remaining remnant of what was a very large phylum of woody gymnosperms that lived in the time of the dinosaurs. They were actually quite common trees before the KT event. Most of the ginkgophytes were wiped out in the KT event. Ginkgo biloba is the only living example. It's noted for its very brightly colored leaves. Look up a picture of a ginkgo tree. They often have bright yellow leaves. Your ginkgos have been used in traditional Chinese medicine for centuries for a wide variety of purposes. Ginkgo extracts supposedly are going to provide virility, longevity, improvements in memory. Not a single one of these features has actually stood up to testing, but you can still find ginkgo supplements in a lot of health food stores and grocery stores and so forth. The ginkgo tree has circular cones, which gives it the appearance of producing a berry or a fruit. It does not. That rounded structure you see is actually the plant's cone. But yeah, so ginkgo biloba, being the only representative of its phylum, is actually doing pretty well for itself. They originated in the Far East. They've been exported all over the world as ornamental trees. They do well in temperate climates. You can probably find some ginkgos around here. All right, how about the phylum Gnetophyta? Gnetophyta, the gnetophytes. Phylum Gnetophyta was a bit of a taxonomic mess for a long time because there are only 70 living species in 3 distinct genera, and those 70 species, or rather there's 3 genera, don't look a lot like each other. In fact, visually speaking, there's really nothing that would clue you into the fact that the living gnetophytes are actually connected to each other at all. We didn't actually know they were part of one monophyletic phylum until genetic sequencing was done on them to try to figure out where these weirdo plants fit into plant taxonomy. And we realized, oh wait, these are all part of one phylum that's very small now, and that most of the ancestral plants in it have gone away, so we can't really see the connections between the living varieties. Phylum Gnetophyta has 3 different genera in it, present in the modern world. We have the genus Welwitschia, Welwitschia, Welwitschia. This is a very strange plant. Genus Welwitschia is going to be a group of plants that are primarily found in southern Africa in desert environments. They have these huge, floppy, strap-like leaves that spread out across the ground. They do very well in extremely arid soils. They're some of the only plants that thrive in the deserts in southern Africa. Look up a picture of Welwitschia. They are strange, strange plants. A much more familiar variety of gnetophytes would be Ephedra. We have Ephedra here in the United States. Tall, thin stems with little rounded berry-looking leaves or cones up the length of them. Ephedra has long had medicinal use. It actually has legitimate medicinal usage as a headache aid and for a few other purposes that are being investigated. We find them here in the US. We also find them in South Asia and a few parts of Africa. And finally, we have the phylum Gnetum, from which the rest of the group gets its name. I'm sorry, I said phylum Gnetum. That's not correct. These are all genera. Welwitschia, Ephedra, and Gnetum. Each of those is a genus within the phylum Gnetophyta. But genus Gnetum is a group that includes some very diverse plants, all native to Southeast Asia. There are some plants in this group that are tree-like. There are some bushy plants. They're characterized by rounded cones, kind of like ginkgo, that look like berries. So the gnetophytes, they're bit players in their ecosystems. There are not a lot of them left. The single biggest representative of the gymnosperms, and the most familiar to all of you, would be the genus Pinophyta. There's an older name. Sometimes they're called Coniferophyta, Pinophyta for Pinophyta, Coniferophyta for Coniferophyta. I prefer Pinophyta. It's the more commonly used term these days. The Pinophytes have been around for quite a while. They were around in the age of dinosaurs. 630 living species of Pinophytes. Pinophytes are what we think of as our coniferous trees, our cone-bearing trees, your evergreens. Think your juniper, your pine, your spruce, your fir. These are all examples of Pinophytes. They're characterized by their needle-like leaves, by their large and abundant cones, by their thick, woody structure, and by their great size. Pinophytes are the largest terrestrial living things on Earth. In fact, if you want to know the biggest living thing on the planet, it is, well, okay, we've got some debate over this because there's some colonial fungi that some people argue that there's this one Swiss fungus colony that's actually all connected underground and might be one single organism. But setting that aside, the biggest individual living thing on our planet is a pinophyte tree, the great redwood tree. You've all heard of great redwoods. They grow abundantly in California. The great redwood is a massive tree, so large that there are great redwood trees that legit have automotive tunnels cut through them, that people have to go through the trunk of the tree because it was so big that it was too large to cut and move when they were building the road, and it was easier just to carve through the tree. So any kind of cone-bearing, fir-bearing tree, those are your pinophytes. They are also among the oldest living things on Earth. In fact, we believe that the oldest individual organism on Earth is a bristlecone pine, native to California. Its name is Methuselah. It's a specific individual tree, not a genus or anything. And Methuselah is in a national park out in California. His location is kept hidden so that some idiot doesn't come and destroy him or break pieces off or whatever. And Methuselah is believed to be more than 5,730 years old, which meant that he started growing about the same time that people were learning how to write. So quite long-lived plants, quite massive plants. Now, there are only 630 living species of pinophytes, but together, the pinophytes on Earth collectively cover about 10% of its land surface area. Because pinophyte forests cover vast swaths of territory. Significant portions of the Pacific Northwest, of Canada, of Russia, of Northern Europe, large amounts of pinophyte forests. They do quite well in cold environments. And yeah, about 10% of the land surface area on Earth is covered by pinophyte forests. So even though there are not all that many species, they are a significant portion of the plant ecosystem. Humans, of course, have been using pinophytes for a long time, both for their wood and for their sap, which has been used as a resin for everything from sealing canoes to attaching arrowheads to the shafts of arrows. And our pinophytes are, of course, a major carbon sink. In fact, they are the single biggest carbon sink alive on Earth today. Those massive woody trees are soaking up a lot of carbon dioxide, and a big part of our solution to solving the climate crisis that we're in right now, frankly, should probably be planting more pinophytes. So our gymnosperms, what they all have in common, of course, the cone is this reproductive structure, no flowers, no fruits. But they are seed plants. They have all the advantages of seed plants. But again, only about 1,000 species of them. The overwhelming majority of plants you will encounter in your day-to-day life, about just shy of 90% of all living plants, belong to a group we call the angiosperms, otherwise known as the flowering plants. Angiosperms are characterized by several different features. Angiosperms are in possession of flowers, of fruits, and of something called endosperm. Endosperm is a nutritive seed tissue that improves the food storage capacity in their seeds. But when you think angiosperms, think flowers and fruits. Those are really the defining qualities of them. Angiosperms have been around for about 192 million years. They were a minor part of the plant ecosystem at first, but they had some significant advantages over gymnosperms. The gymnosperms, nonetheless, were still the most common plants in the landscape up until the KT event. Right about that time, the angiosperms are beginning to become more dominant. The coevolution of pollinating insects with them is really starting to help them out right about when the KT event hits. The KT event kills off most of the gymnosperm species. For a little while, the landscape is largely dominated by ferns, but then the angiosperms, which survived way better than everything else, move in to fill the ecological niches. There's significant adaptive radiation, remember that term, of angiosperms following the KT event, and they are now the most significant part of the plant ecosystem today. All living angiosperms belong to a single phylum right now, the phylum Anthophyta, I-N-T-H-O-P-H-Y-T-A, sometimes called Magnolia phyta, M-A-G-N-I-O-L-I-A-I-O-P-H-Y-T-A. the Magnolia phyto. Now, you can use either term for that one. There is, as I said earlier, a lot of debate about this. Most botanists believe that we've lumped together all flowering plants into one heading that is probably not a good inclusive heading, and we should probably split it up a bit more, but there's no good agreement on the best way to do that. Expect that we're probably going to have more than one angiosperm phylum sooner rather than later. About 250,000 known living species, maybe as many as 400,000 living species. There is some debate about this. For reasons I mentioned earlier in the last lecture, it's not always clear if the same plant has been classified 2 different ways in 2 different places, or if plants that look very different from one another are actually closely related. It's a common thing in the plant world, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly how many angiosperms there are. So, what makes angiosperms special?